Hello. Today we will be hearing from Josh Hawley, who will be talking to us about the Ohio and the Longitudinal Data Archive. The Ohio Longitudinal Data Archive was established in 2007. In the last 5 years, there have been 28 published studies that have used data access through the Ohio Longitudinal Data Archive, OLDA. The OLDA's primary research focus is on outcomes of education and training, but it also engages with researchers on human services, housing, and healthcare as need arises. It's a collaboration between the Ohio State government and Ohio State University to make longitudinal data from multiple state agencies available for research. And it's an example, especially in the context of this handbook, of a robust institutional partnership for researchers and data providers looking to work with data and to launch their own data center. Josh Hawley is a professor in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. He also serves in leadership roles at two research centers at OSU, Director of the Ohio Education Research Center and Associate Director for the Center for Human Resource Research. And with that, I invite you to listen to Josh's talk.
Hi, my name is Josh Hawley, and I'm a professor here at The Ohio State University. I work at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, and I have a joint appointment also in the Center for Human Resource Research and Arts and Sciences, as well as directing something called the Ohio Education Research Center here at the Glenn College. In that role with the university, I have worked with state of Ohio for close to 20 years in different capacities. In the most recent kind of decade, the work has kind of extended to developing a data system called the Ohio Longitudinal Data Archive. And that's the subject of the webinar and the subject of the chapter I wrote for the book. I'm going to start off by kind of telling you a little bit about what we're going to do today. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about some motivating questions, a little bit about the basics behind the OLDA, our current data holdings, some example projects, some things I'm calling rules of the road, which are really about governance and data use, and then offer just some initial final thoughts about for you if you're developing your own system or thinking about systems that you use. So the first thing I want to note is just kind of to talk a little bit about what it means to be a faculty member in this day and age. When I started in university as a professor, I had a couple of years of experience as a consultant and a few years of experience as a middle school teacher. And I don't think the middle school teaching really helped much until I had my own kids. But the consulting experience was important in that it made me somewhat kind of pessimistic about the role of a faculty member in a traditional university sense. I wasn't much interested in traditional publishing, and I actually thought I would try teaching in a university for a few years and see what happened. But it gives you kind of some critical questions about government itself. What do you want to do when you actually want to be a participant with government in the activity? And what role does the university kind of bring, particularly a state university, to this process? So to that end, then, we have built a system at The Ohio State University that allows us to engage with government and provides government the technical architecture through data management that they can kind of interact with the university and with faculty in a regularized way. Some basic facts about the OLDA, because I think it's important just to start with some sense of what we've done. This project exists and has existed for 10 to maybe 15 years. It's hard to actually date the founding. It's a collaborative project, and it is a signed agreement between the university and a number of state agencies. It stores data. That's one of the main reasons it exists, to store data at the university on behalf of the state agencies. And then those data are available for external and internal use. So in other words, internal to the state and then external to the state in terms of university or other partners. And the long-term goal here is to generate evidence-based research used by both researchers and government and improve public policy. What that can mean in the long run really depends on your kind of your questions that you have as a state agency and your interests as a researcher. It's not particularly well suited for what we might call basic research. It is much more suited for research to practice, research in action, kind of partnership research, any of those kinds of research we tend to focus on. The OLDA is kind of a historical evolution of my activities at the university and others at OSU. So prior to 2007, there was just a lot going on in different parts of the university and the state in terms of partnerships with faculty. I was doing some work on remediation, done work on kind of adult vocational education. All of that required data. Another faculty member had done a lot of work on welfare reform, some kind of tracking data. And there were a bunch of kind of independent education projects that involved prominent researchers from around the country. So at the same time, there was a lot of this technical development at the state. So due to kind of just changes in technology, the state of Ohio had bought and built different data systems for its K through 12 and its higher ed data. Then it had legacy systems on UI claims, unemployment insurance claims. And those data systems kind of came together at different points to be useful or not. At the same time, there were exemplar systems in states like Florida that brought these data together in more important and useful ways. So you have this kind of researchers increasingly requesting the data. You have new data systems that exist, and you've got exemplary kind of architectures systems out there. Along comes a lot of federal investment, and federal investment was critical in a number of areas. So the Workforce Data Quality Initiative was a Department of Labor and still is a Department of Labor project. In Ohio and among other states had some significant investment that we helped direct here. The ERA funding, which was the funding that the federal government put into place after the last recession, was critical. It provided a good deal of money to states in exchange for very direct policy action, some of which required new data systems. And we, again, just kind of rode that wave and helped the state kind of put that system together. And in many cases, you saw kind of during this period of time, you saw very rapid expansion of integrated data use across the states. So a lot of states saw the genesis of their longitudinal data systems to this period of time. It wasn't simply the federal investment. There was just an accumulation of kind of effort and interest on the part of researchers, on the part of state government. And I don't think we're special in this respect. I think a lot of states benefited from this. Many of the systems were very internally focused, however, and I think that is somewhat different here in that they were driven by the need to integrate data within states, not to give researchers access to some of the data. So at the end of all this federal investment, of course, there was a transition. We had really a sustainability transition where we had to figure out how to stay in business if we wanted to, because it is a soft money operation, just like most faculty kind of research projects are. And we also had to see what our priorities would be in the future. So we made that transition to additional funding. And the state kind of has been very supportive. So in addition to facing kind of a sustainability challenge, we also had new questions that came to mind. And those questions required that we think about integrating data across states. And that's been a labor of love, I would like to say, for the last 4 or 5 years, is with our partner states in the Midwest, trying to figure out how to share labor market, education, unemployment insurance data across the states to be able to better measure the effects of different state and federal policies. And we've done an enormous amount of work with our colleagues at the Coleridge Initiative, which is an independent nonprofit that works on this area. We've also profited from better technology. So one of the realities in the post-2012 era is cloud-based storage and cloud-based systems that make use of FedRAMP compliant data systems. And both our state and the Coleridge Initiative have migrated to cloud-based storage to an extent. And that's an important technical lesson that we have. Ohio, to get just kind of highlighted two areas here. One is the university role. Ohio kind of provides an example of what happened during the era, and other universities have similar stories. I think that prior to 2008, we really profited from having some outstanding faculty in various departments that were using administrative data. And these were primarily upon request from the state or the federal government or from private organizations. And one early way that was all brought together was something called ADARE. ADARE was a project that Steve Wadner and David Stevenson. Steve was at DOL, and Dave Stevenson was at University of Baltimore, Maryland. And they brought the states together to really link training and labor data in unique ways within states, but in parallel questioning. And that was one of the first kind of cross-state labor education workforce projects I was involved in a significant way. And there are a lot of kind of advantages of these early projects. One I want to flag that's also in the literature quite a bit around data systems and vocational education, which is one of my substantive areas of interest, is that when you kind of work with the state or federal government, having what might be called the circulation of human capital is really critical. So having people who go from the government to the university to a nonprofit to a business in different roles, but have kind of connections and can see the value of working together. It's quite important. And so at a certain point, we had a former labor market information systems director come to OSU and work in the center, CHRR, and that was critical because she knew a great deal about the data systems that we did not, and knew also which questions were relevant at the state and federal level. And I kind of soaked that up like a sponge. That kind of connection. I think you also just have to be patient. I like to when younger people ask me, about getting into data systems work, I say 10 years. Just you got to invest at least 10 years to build something. And anybody who wants to do something more quickly is dreaming. So that's just one lesson. The second lesson is about the relationship to federal investment. And again, there's a fairly good public administration literature on this, but federal investment is critical to both deepen and quicken kind of program outcomes in the states. And so the fact that the federal government had big data programs like the Workforce Data Quality Initiative or the State Longitudinal Data System at the K through 12 level, which I've not talked about previously, is really critical for building legal and administrative frameworks for sharing data. So we had these systems, the federal government invested in them, and it meant that different states could get access to resources, but also the technical assistance that developed from the state systems. And so for a while on the WDQI side, we met regularly in Washington or in other states. States would call us for advice. We would travel. When we could travel and it wasn't COVID, and we would provide kind of guidance. And it was fairly informal. There wasn't a great deal of structure. And I also really like the informality of technical assistance. I think it grows really well when people can call upon experts that they trust, and those experts don't have a stake in their game at their state level. And Race to the Top is which was the ERA funding equivalent, is the accelerator of all accelerators. It was an enormous amount of money, some of which was spent on data systems in specific states. And I think it really did seed a lot of work locally here in Ohio that we could do and allowed us to experiment in many ways. So the data systems that we have available, we have data from the Department of Higher Ed, the Department of Education, the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, which is a large agency that has several divisions. Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which operates the Vocational Rehabilitation Services, and the Ohio Housing Finance Agency. And what you have in front of you is basically a map of recent map of data holdings, and you can see both the periodicity of the data and the number of files we get from specific agencies vary quite a bit. So, for example, we're very much up to date on unemployment insurance claims because of the crisis. We get pretty much everything as quickly as we possibly can. In addition, we're getting some really new data on home buyers from Housing Finance Agency. And then a lot of the files are yearly, so they still show 2019 because we haven't gotten our 2020 data pull. So, you have a fair bit of kind of variation in the data system, but they're all kind of available as individual level files that are that researchers can apply to access. And if they can frame their project well enough for the state audience, and if it can pass kind of IRB and other security restrictions, then there is a possibility of getting some of this data linked together by our staff, because that's one of the services we provide. And then you can do a lot of very interesting projects, some of which I'll go over in a few minutes. So there's a couple facts here that I just wanted to highlight. They're kind of like, to me, greatest hits in some ways about data systems. Administrative data is what it is. It's a layer cake. You can't change it. It's not survey data. The variables are not created for your specifications or to your liking. They change over time. They're missing. And you just have to accept that reality. Two specific examples. One is education credentials, and other are occupational codes, both of which are really critical kind of input or output for the education system. We don't get to decide what education credentials the state government codes based on data, nor do we get to decide what the occupational structure of the labor market is. Both of those are imposed from the outside. So when researchers say to me, I would like, my, 16, Baskin flavors of ice cream today, please, all of which have different, kind of characteristics, I would say you can have these two, vanilla and chocolate, and either you can like it or you can move on, but there's nothing I can do about what's available. The second thing is metadata is really important. I cannot tell you how often I talk to people who are computer scientists and they kind of have this belief that you can wish into existence knowledge about data systems, variables, and values by just kind of dumping it into a kind of a spaghetti map. That's not the way knowledge about data systems exists. What's called the data generating process, how the data come to be, the administrative systems, the educational programs, the workforce programs, there's a lot of knowledge that's baked in that you need to access to be able to interpret the data correctly. And so one of the most important things we do with researchers is we provide them with some of that content knowledge. You need to have the human capital, the people in place, and you need to pay for those people over time as part of a research effort. And you can't simply write it all down. It will not. Um, Data maintenance is critical. Data changes. It's not a shiny new toy all the time. It's stored in different kind of systems. The great example from New Jersey this year, where they had to put like an all points bulletin out for any COBOL programmers to work on their ancient unemployment claims data. It illustrated the fact that data systems are old and have been neglected, and government does not normally update them the way industry would update kind of new toys. And I would say public agencies are not any different than private firms. I've had the same conversation about COBOL programmers with bank technologists from Columbus. They still use COBOL for a lot of their back-end systems at banks. So, just because a data system is old doesn't mean it's bad. But you do have to, kind of account for that maintenance cost and account for the maintenance human capital needs over time. You can't simply hire people or have staff that know the new stuff. The other thing that's kind of a key fact here is questions. Everything's about what's important to the government at the time, which means you as a researcher have to compromise. That I know that's a shocker for many of us in academia, and it's the one thing that I alluded to at the beginning that I was most excited about. I have interest, but I don't care what the way I ask things can be framed in a way that is useful to government. And so we receive many requests that seem very much out of left field to government because they haven't been couched in a policy term. They've been couched in the language of econometrics or kind of quantitative sociology, the two principal disciplines we receive applications from. When they need to go talk to a legislator, they need to go talk to a government affairs person in their university, and they need to reframe what they're asking. That's not my job as the operator of the OLDA to reframe your questions for you. And over time, we've gotten better at forcing researchers to process that and come up with questions that are on their end better, so that our clients in the state can understand those questions. And this is only going to become more important as we work with more cross-state data, because nobody's going to be able to understand the esoteric econometrics question, unless it's framed in a common way across states. So some example studies, we've done both. We've done an enormous number of different kinds of studies for the state, in addition to funding researchers to do them or researchers approaching us. All of that stuff happens. So just some examples, and you have some images in front of you on the screen. We've done quite a bit of work on student dropping out from high school early on during the post or kind of during era and after era. STEM has been an increasingly important interest over time, both STEM at the high school level, but also STEM at post-secondary. And I would say increasingly the focus is turning to kind of the labor market, strict labor market side, so the unemployment claims, transition of particular groups into the labor market. We've done a recent kind of RCT, randomized controlled trial, with youth who are having trouble accessing the labor market throughout Ohio. So there's different kinds of projects that we've done. And I think there's also then, we kind of, again, because we're trying to be useful to government and not simply use data that exists in government for our own research purposes, we've gotten a lot of requests for dashboards. And so we've become quite adept at both the technical dashboard work using tools, just web development tools or tools like Shiny or more increasingly something like Tableau, which provides for quicker, rapid cycle development. You just have two in front of you. There's plenty more. One is called the Workforce Success Measures. The Workforce Success Measures came about at a request from the governor's office 8-9 years ago, I think. And at that point, it was a new administration from John Kasich and a requirement that he wanted to manage the kind of different programs from the Workforce WIOA Act, the Workforce Act at the federal level. He wanted to have a dashboard that allowed him to see the common outcomes and calculate what are called the common measures for each of those programs, which include things like, how much money did people make 2 quarters after they finished a program, 4 quarters after they finished a program, were they retained in a job, and those kinds of metrics, just comparison across programs. And so doing the computational work on the dashboard was complicated, but also building a tool that would meet the needs of kind of county executives, the state agencies, the governor's office. That's the thing we do. And we're actually now on our 3rd or 4th, I think, generation of that project this year. We have a fairly tight timeline to rebuild it for the spring. And then we have a lot of work we've done on employment and educational projections with the Department of Higher Education and Job and Family Services, which operates a site called Ohio Means Jobs, which provides job seekers and really anyone in Ohio with access to a series of tools. Several of which are tools we've developed. One here is on employment projections, so you can go in and look at what jobs are available in what fields and where they are and how much they pay. Those kinds of good questions, and it's linked up to all this really important data that we maintain. The last kind of substantive area I want to talk about is what I call rules of the road. So it can be really daunting to set one of these systems up, and as I confessed at the beginning, I didn't know we were setting this up 15, 20 years ago when I started doing this work. But having done this, I have some suggestions for those of you, and now I'm speaking to kind of government officials around the world or academics who are trying to set up these things. Pay attention to governance. It is the place you will get more, be able to get more out of these investments. It is also the place that you're most likely to fall down on it. And I didn't build this framework. I borrowed much of it from other states like Washington and Florida, and also from my experience, oddly enough, doing work internationally with international organizations like UNESCO and the UNDP and others where I'd done data work in part of education projects. So my sense of governance is that there needs to be a policy level governance. There needs to be somebody who's in charge, talking to somebody else who's in charge at another agency, talking about data. And so we have something called the Policy Council. It advocates for the system. It kind of sets agendas. It supervises me basically, and they supervise kind of decision funding and data decisions. And we've met pretty much at this point every quarter, I would say for the last 8 to 10 years. And so we have a lot of kind of time together that allows us to then pursue other efforts collectively and be a trusted partner. We also have something called the coordinating board. This is just a contractual kind of relationship. We need to have a group that actually can get together and approve invoices, approve project budgets, and serve as the most direct point for me to be accountable to the state government. And then we have a third layer of something called data stewards, which in a lot of systems can be separated by domain. these are the technical staff in each agency, and in our sense, this can get quite big sometimes because each agency may have 2 or 3 analysts working on the data set that we're interested in, and sometimes those data sets um, are more complicated. So what I would suggest is to you is to think about the policy level, the kind of financial, operational level, and the data level at very minimum. And on the data side, you might also subset that nowadays into content and security, because both are important. Just to give you a little bit how that fits into what we do here at Ohio State, we have our mission really, because we're a university center, is, so we have this project, the OLDA, and then I have the sign behind my head this entire time I'm talking intentionally, because the OLDA is a project of a research center that's a faculty-generated operation at Ohio State. It exists as a funded project. I created the effort at a certain point, and myself and others, and I have a staff that works together on kind of bigger stuff than just the data system. So we have more at stake. And so the data system work fits into kind of best practice work. It fits into kind of what might be called stakeholder engagement with educators, policymakers. And we also develop, when we can, kind of dashboards, scorecards, materials. We have a whole kind of best practice repository we've built on educational practices for the Ohio Department of Education. So there's an enormous array of things that we can do, and the data system work is part of it. It's a key part. My vision, and I've said this very transparently in a number of places, is that we're kind of creating cutting-edge knowledge and resources for Ohio, for educators, policymakers, and community leaders. It's a cycle. I mean, I think policy implementation, policy evaluation are part of kind of cycles, and getting the best outcomes for the children and for workers in Ohio, who are mostly the subjects of the data, requires kind of evaluation. It requires kind of guest speaking, best practice work, engagement with community leaders. We did a fascinating project that's about to be released on the future of smart work with the city of Columbus that represented a lot of engagement activity with the city and the community leaders in the city. And I think at the end of the day, then knowledge improves, and that's an academic goal, but it's also a societal goal. So just finally, as a faculty member, I want to just encourage you to constantly remake your own job. There's a diminishing number of us. You have to be very careful and intentional about what will make an impact. And I think the danger of COVID in a very real way for faculty life is it isolates you more and more. I mean, I'm in the office today teaching this afternoon in person, which is a rarity these days, at least in Ohio. But I think it's important point to make that people can be engaged with students, engaged with policymakers, but you have to be very intentional. You have to not let yourself be isolated in your study doing data work on your own. It makes it really hard. So I do think COVID kind of makes it clear that the traditional recipe of the mix, research, service, and teaching needs to be rethought fundamentally. Particularly at land-grant institutions, all research is research to practice and partnership research. And I think lastly are specific lessons we've gained here at Ohio State and others places can be translated to other countries and universities. And I really look forward to, I have a sabbatical coming up in Southeast Asia, and I'm working on some of these issues on data and labor data and data utilization in some of those contexts. So I look forward to dialoguing with you next week when this video airs, and you'll see here ways to contact me and my staff, and don't hesitate to reach out if you're seeing this on broadcast later. Thank you so much for your attention.